got a lot of the most interesting stuff to cover today, all on scheduling and monitoring. Everything from the soil to evapotranspiration, and then we'll end up looking a little bit at automation after some stuff on soil monitoring. So it's going to be really good stuff we have lined up. Thank you, Bruce, for being with us today. Thank you to our sponsors, the Climate and Agriculture Initiative, and all the people that support them, the Columbia Basin Trust, and the Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors. I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to steal some of Bruce's thunder here to refocus on one of our main goals right from the beginning, which is to save you time and money and help to grow more. Before I do, though, also big thanks to Andrew Peterson from the Ministry of Agriculture. Pretty soon with the Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors, we are going to be getting Andrew on Zoom for an interactive question and answer on groundwater licensing. So stay tuned for that. If you're not already signed up with KBFA's newsletter, that's probably one of the ways that we'll promote that. Also, a big thanks to Ted Vandergulik, who's got his fingers in every pie, and you'll see I'm about to show you some of my favorite resources, and he's been involved in all of them, if not written the book. So I want to get back right to what is the point of what we're trying to do here. The first thing is we need to make sure our irrigation systems are running correctly. Correctly means that we're getting the water where we need it. It's reaching the roots. There's a lot of ways that it cannot reach the roots, or that it will reach some roots too much and some roots not enough. That's unevenness, or it'll flow right over the surface and run off, even cause erosion. So when we say that a sprinkler system is 72% efficient, that's in an ideal situation where we've got everything right. The pressures are right. The spacing is right. We've dealt with all the leaks. We've made sure that we don't have worn nozzles. Or in a drip system, it means that we've got the pressures right in the lines and the emitters are the right size and they're not spraying out all over the place. We're definitely not getting 92% efficiency with this emitter. Anything that isn't even means lower yields. Plants are going to do poorly with either too much or too little water. So this is what we've more or less covered in the last 3 sessions. And we're going to do a question and answer and a review of all 4 sessions on June 23rd. So I'll send you a registration link by email after today. And do click on that and join us on June 23rd. We're going to check out the PowerPoints. At least we'll have them available so that we can review slides if you want to go back and look at a slide. But we're really going to be focusing on questions and answers. And it's not going to be recorded. So it's basically turn up and ask your question. It's not going on YouTube. It's just strictly to focus on questions and answers. When we get all of this right, what we're really looking at here, that's where the savings is if you can get your irrigation system even, that's where the money is. That's where the good crops are. That's where the savings from pump costs, the savings from not from wasted time fixing systems. Then we come to today, scheduling. Even if you have a perfectly tuned system, if you don't have the right schedule, it's all out the window. You could have the best irrigation system. It's perfectly even. It does everything just the way you want. The pressures are perfect. The droplet size is excellent. But if you didn't start irrigating in time, or if you irrigate way too much through the whole season because you just sort of turn it on and go and you don't pay attention to the weather, you're going to waste a ton of water. And that's bad for yields. It's bad for leached fertility. It could stress plants. This will stress plants for sure. Having no water, clearly more stressful. You're going to waste your time. You're going to waste pump energy. These are the losses. So the quickest way to schedule, I just want to plug this. Bruce is going to go into the more sophisticated way to schedule. But the quickest and easiest thing you can do is get on BC Agriculture Water Calculator, put in your details, your crop, soil type, sprinkler type, where you are, and plug in 1 acre. And then change this unit for estimated demand to acre feet. So that if you have 1 acre over an acre foot, or at least you have an acre foot over an acre, these values then are in feet. So that's 0.27 of a foot of water. So you just multiply that by 12, convert it to inches. And you can use the BC Ag water calculator to get yourself a pretty rough idea of how many inches of water you should be putting on in a month. So that's just a little quick trick, fast, dirty schedule that'll get you roughly right. And we'll talk about getting closer than roughly right right now. The other issue is drought or not having enough water. I'd really like to encourage everybody to check out the drought management fact sheets from the ministry. There's a whole series of them. And this is one of my favorites. What are you meant to do if you don't have enough water? Should you spread it out all evenly across all your fields, or just pick one area and do it right? And, you know, spoiler alert, the answer is do one area right. And this really comes back to why we need good irrigation systems. If you are spreading out, if you are putting on your water poorly, that is an enormous yield impact. Even in a drought, the best thing you can do is irrigate properly in a smaller area. There's all these other titles in that drought management fact sheet. I really recommend them. Outside of the fact sheets, these are the top guides. We're going to be going into Farm West a lot today, and the Agricultural Irrigation Scheduling Calculator from the Irrigation Association of British Columbia. Those two are really key. In fact, everything you need is in this scheduling calculator. All of the constants and fancy calculations that happen in the sprinkler manual and in the trickle manual are embedded into the scheduling calculator, so you don't even have to think about them. So really, this is the one-stop shop that you're going to want to go to. The Irrigation Management Guide also has some useful information. You're going to see a few items later on today that are from that manual. These all free online. You'd have to buy the trickle manual, but don't bother buying the trickle manual. Just get on and use that agricultural irrigation scheduling calculator. And of course, there's BC Soil Information Finder tool. You'll see that in a moment. That's the best way to find out about your soils. And thanks very much, Bruce. There we go. Now it's over to you. How much should we water, Bruce, and how often?
Well, thank you. So today we're going to talk about how much and how often we need to irrigate based on the soil textures, evapotranspiration, moisture monitoring, and of course, automation. So with that information that we gather from how much water we require and how often, we want to create a schedule. We want to know how much water has to be replaced. We want to look at the evapotranspiration rates. We have to obviously, as we discussed in former modules, the inefficiencies of the system and how that impacts things, and how often. Happy plants, no stress, soil moisture, with sprinklers, 50% or more, drip irrigation, 75% or more moisture levels are required. So here's the process that we're going to be going through on all this. The things that we have to look at in order to obtain this schedule is we have to look at what type of irrigation system do you have? What is your soil like? We want to know your weather region. Then the specifics about the crop. How much water does that crop require of the evapotranspiration rate? Moisture monitoring. We have to, that's something we want to look at. So, you know, the depiction on the right shows how we get a lot of this information. Weather comes from weather stations. So I'll be talking a little bit about weather stations or options and how you can get your weather information. We talked about the irrigation agricultural scheduler right there. And then we want to analyze the soil. So there's various methods we can go about that, from the very basic to a little bit more sophisticated, and we'll go through that as well. So irrigation types, the flows and the efficiencies, these are all vital information in order for us to facilitate being able to do a schedule. Just a couple back on this slide here. Last year, when Andrew and I went on our trip across the Kootenays, we saw a lot of very interesting things. I want to just point out a couple of neat things on this one here. The picture on the left shows a pivot. And what's unique about that pivot is this particular farm was very innovative, where they utilize one pivot and they move it around from 2 to 3 different fields. So with that pivot, they have the ability, with a little bit of work, but it's saving them the money of having to buy 3 pivots in order to do that. The picture in the middle there is an example of subsurface drip, putting it in under the surface. The picture on the right, which I'm going to bringing up further, is it's showing a traveling gun, and it's showing how they are affected by winds. And that's a strong wind blowing the water away from that gun there. Okay, so we need to know the flows. I mean, obviously your flows are going to be different. In a drip irrigation system, you're going to be dripping from a point source, and those emitters are going to be flowing out in flows in gallons per hour. You need to know the spacing of those emitters over a given distance, and then we can determine how many emitters there are per tree, so we can determine exactly how much water is being flown. This is obviously very vital for us to be able to obtain that schedule. Sprinklers is a little bit different. We need to work out the application rate in inches per hour. So you divide the gallons per minute divided by the spacing. And in this case here, utilizing this 2.17 gallon per minute sprinkler, we have a application rate of 0.14 inches per hour. You can see that that is on that chart there. Obviously, digging down and getting our soil textures is necessary. The picture on the right in here, I'll just that one there, we wanted to get down, this was on a pasture crop, and we wanted to get down to 3-4 feet to put in the sensor. Well, you can see how far I got. So, I mean, the challenges are there. You need a good auger, or you need some way of getting down. So be prepared. So for those of you who haven't seen the soil triangle, here, this is the soil triangle on the left, soil triangle here giving us our textures. The numbers are obviously telling you the amounts, the percentage. So the clay on the top part of the triangle, you see your readings from 50 to 100% clay portion. And then as you go down on the bottom, you have sand and silt on the right-hand side. So where you sit is dependent on the levels of each of those different soils in the soil triangle. The hand feel chart is another way that we can get those textures. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time on that. You moisten your soil, you put it in your hand, you try to form a ball, and your success with that with sand is not going to do very well. With a loam, you might be able to get a long snake-like substance, as you see in the middle. Clay, you could form a ball very easily. Lab tests are obviously the ideal way, and I will be mentioning that a few more times, but it is also very important to auger down into your soil. The top 6 inches, which is what you see on a lot of charts, is not necessarily going to facilitate what you need to know. Depending on your crop, your active root zone is going to vary. So we need to auger down and be aware of that based on the crop that you're growing in that soil. So here's a sample of the British Columbia Soil Information Finders tool, which you can go to. You can get a far better detail of your soils for your given area. So if you are looking for the best way, without sending your soils to the lab, this is probably a good way for you to get some accurate knowledge of your various layers of soil. So on the soil, just to give you an example here, how this works, if you were to get the details of your soil, let's look at the circle on the right-hand side, which shows you an example of a sandy loam soil. So you have there a depth of 20 centimeters within that sandy loam soil, and you have the factors that are going to affect that. You have your coarse fragments, which is under the CO. So you have the percentage of that, your sand percentage, your silt, and your clay percentages. And then you have your, pardon me, the fine versus coarse percentages of soil. So they're going to do a comparison of that. And then on the very right-hand side, you have your very fine soil sample percentage. And with all of that, you're getting a lot of information at that depth. And then if you go down to different depths, you can see how that varies accordingly. Here we're looking at ideal efficiencies. We've gone over this before. We've looked at the efficiencies of various irrigation systems, going all the way from the subsurface irrigation system, which is 95% efficient, all the way down to our traveling guns and our set guns, which are 65 to 58% efficient. Now, these are all based on ideal conditions. They're based on the system working effectively. And as we discussed before, effectively means that the water is going to where we want it to go. There's not leaks in the system. The nozzle sizes are all accurate. So in order to do that, and if you are unsure, it's very important that you not automatically assume your system is this much. So if you have an under tree or sprinkler system, don't assume it's 75% efficient. You maybe want to assess that, especially if it's older, because obviously a system that's 50% efficient, you have to water significantly longer. As the notation in the middle of the screen show you with a sprinkler system, 72% efficient. If you required 1 inch of water for your crop, you would actually have to apply 1.4 inches gross in order to facilitate getting the amount of water you need. So back to that picture, the slide that showed that traveling gun where most of the water was blowing right back at it. You can just imagine that system is 65% efficient with that type of a wind factor. And you got to be cognizant of that when you're planning a schedule. If you have a lot of wind, keep that in mind. You should make some changes in spacing and other things, but it's part of the equation to proper schedule. So soil water storage, when you're looking at soils, when you have a bone dry soil, obviously you have a problem. If you have too much water in your soil, it's going to leach out of your root zone and it's going to saturate your ground. Where we're going to start off is we want to be at field capacity. Field capacity is based on after water is drained out of the soil and the downward action of water moving through the soil is stopped, usually depending on the soil, but that'll take 2 to 3 days. At that juncture is where you have field capacity, and then you will deplete the amount of water down to 50% of that. And at that point, we're deeming it's time to start irrigating your soils. Now, be cognizant, and it's important that we identify the type of soils you have, but as you can see, a sandy soil will only store up to 1 inch in a foot of water, a soil, I should say, versus you get down in the middle to a silt loam, you're at a 2.5 inches per foot. And then you're down at your clay and your organics, and you can be between 2.4 and 3. So there's quite a variance in the amount of water you have. So all of this has to be blended into that equation to facilitate your schedule needs. Allowable depletion, 50% or less of soil water is easily available. Now, there are factors which are going to vary on that. If you were looking at potatoes, for example, the allowable depletion is only 35%. For a lot of our tree fruit crops, we're at 40%. And then in the situation for pretty well everything else, we're using a 50% allowable depletion factor. So rooting depths, effective rooting depths. So we have to be cognizant of this. So here's, you got your rooting depth of your crop, total water storage capacity based on the soil you have, and then the allowable depletion is all going to be giving us some sort of indication of how much water that we can store. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing what in a 1 foot depth soil, 2 foot, 3 foot, and 4 foot. So depending on your crop, you'll be looking at that for your root zone storage capacity. Evapotranspiration. Plants need water to grow. Obviously they do. This is part of that same trip we had in, I'll tell you, the farm on the left there was one of the most efficient systems I've seen set up with a traveling reel. It looked like a park. That's in the Grand Forks area. Okay, evapotranspiration. So peak ET, which is what we were looking at, evapotranspiration, is based on evapotranspiration is that evaporates to the soil surfaces as well as to what is transpired or used by the plant. It's affected by wind, it's affected by humidity and temperature and solar radiation. What we are trying to determine right now for evapotranspiration, your base evapotranspiration rate that you start with is ET reference. Okay, next slide, please. Where do you get some information on if you don't have access to a weather station? Well, Farm West, which has many, every dot indicates various Farm West weather site. And if you look closely, you can see the in the Kootenay area in the middle there. There's a few, but they're spread quite far apart. I know that I was working with the Farm West group a little bit last year in setting up some weather stations. They had a little bit of money for that area there, but if there is areas there that you advocate the need of a weather station, that's something that maybe you can pass on to Andrew, and he can pass it on, because they're looking for good cases to why they should have some in that area. Last year we put them in Grand Forks, big farming community. They were able to put one in. The different colors that are on here are various. The ownership of the weather stations falls into different groups, but these are all under the umbrella of the Farm West sites. Forecasted ET. So for a given area here, this particular one is showing some historical data of your ET for the month of June, and this is ET reference. ET reference, by the way, is based on a grass crop, turf crop. So obviously it has to be changed specifically to the crop that you are irrigating, because we're not all working with a 6-inch root zone on a turf crop. This Warfield station that we have up here is showing some ET rates, total precipitation, moisture deficit. And what you're going to see here is that the historical averages are changing over a period of time. And so the numbers that I think that we were looking at, the ET reference numbers, the 4.26 on June the 8th up to the Saturday, the 4.41. These are all a lot lower than is necessarily happening right now. So things are changing. ET estimates, make a good guess. Reference crops. Well, as I just finished saying, your reference ET is on a 6 to 12-inch grass turf crop. In order for you to obtain an ET for the crop that you have to take your ET reference and you multiply it by a crop coefficient, your KC. So that's going to vary from crop to crop, and that's based on the crop. We looked at the amount of water that is sucked. We were looking at anything from 35% depletion rates on potatoes up to your where a majority of crops are looking at a 50% crop coefficient. That's what we're looking at. The Penman Monteith ET, it doesn't matter, but a lot of the weather stations that are out there are the ones that we want. It's giving you temperature, wind speed, solar radiation, humidity, and it is actually giving you an ET reference to work from. ET temperature only is not always the best for what we need. You see that at airports. Some of the weather station sites are just airport sites. They may not give us all the information that we necessarily need. Okay, so here we're looking at to show you the example of how crop coefficient works. Crop coefficients on this graph here on the left-hand side, starting from 0 to 0.5, 50% crop coefficient up to 1, up to a 1.2. This is showing on the alfalfa crop in the green there, first cut, second cut, third cut, and it shows you how your crop coefficients do change based on that. And then here on the red one is showing us ET for apples. And so your initial crop coefficients, as you see at the top for apples and alfalfa, 0.4 for the alfalfa, 0.5 for apples. And then in the middle of the season, we are looking at 1.2 crop coefficient for both. And then when we get tail off to the end of the year, the crop coefficients for alfalfa would be a 1.15, and on apples, we're at a 0.85 factor. So all crops are not the same. All are not affected by the temperature, radiation, etc. at the same rates. Each plant is different, and so you need to know the coefficient for your specific crop in order to accurately determine your water requirement. Here's an example of at the Warfield station again, where they had 36 millimeters of rain falling between June 21st and 28th. 50% of that, or 18 millimeters, is effective. That's the actual technical way that they determine that is the first 5 millimeters of water that you get. They don't count for being effective rainfall. They take 75% of the rest. That works out to 50% in most instances. We have an 18 millimeter effective rainfall. So if you calculate your ET reference at 7 millimeters per day, and it's going to vary from crop to crop, obviously, you will have no water left in 3 days. So just because you have a big rainfall doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be available to the plant. It's a good idea to be monitoring your soil at the depths that your crop, the active root zone of that crop is, to make sure that you have water down there. That 36 millimeters of rain, if you went back a week later, you're going to be playing catch up. If you have a drip irrigation system, you might have a heck of a time doing that. So let's crunch the numbers. Give you some examples of how this all works. Okay, this is using that IIABC's BC Agricultural Scheduler calculator. What this calculator is quite slick. You get the information. They have questions that you have to answer at the beginning part of it. If any of you need to go to this, just go to IIABC's website, look at their tools and the calculators, click on the agricultural calculator, and you just have to answer some of the questions that are in here in order to put out your schedule. It's going to take a little bit of time to get used to, but if you want to use it, you could get a hold of somebody from the IABC, you could get a hold of Andrew, get a hold of me, and we can help you out on it, hopefully. So in this case, where we're utilizing drip irrigation, we need to know how many emitters are we putting out per plant. So if you have a long row, you have to know if it's inline drip, you have to know the spacing of the emitters versus spacing of the trees to determine that. You need to know the flow rate of each individual emitter on the line. So that's why it's important to make sure that the flows are consistent. And then the irrigation interval, how often are you going to be irrigating? Drip irrigation is typically watered every day versus sprinklers, which is differently. Your application efficiencies, all these questions are answered for you. You don't have to fill these in, as well as the uniformity. Uniformity tells you how efficient are these emitters in their uniformity on a given line. So these particular ones, you don't want to look at 85%. Is all right. 90% is better for your uniformity. Water supply per plant, in this case, is going to be 3.5 gallons per hour. So based on that, we know that we have to that's going to take 3 hours for us to put down that 10.5 gallons of water that you require. Your soil type is important, so you're going to put your soil type in there. Here we have a silt loam. If your soil varies, if you know that for a fact, you could have that for every foot of soil in there, every 6 inches of soils for that matter, you could fill that in to get your detailing all that much more important. It's just you got to make sure that every different level that you have adds up to the 3 feet in this case of what you have. So if your math is wrong, it's not going to give you an answer. The availability coefficient, the crop coefficient, obviously are programmed into the software based on the crop you have. Leaching factor is on all drip irrigations. Leaching factor is to leach the salts out of the soil. So we want to put that factor into our equation to get leach the salt out of our soils. And our maximum soil water deficit, that at 2.7 inches. So your monthly climate modifier, they're using this. And I want to just point this out because we're going to be getting back to this a little bit later. Here's some factors. So if you look at June is at 1, July, August, we were actually 1.1. So your modifier on your climate is at 1.1, 10% over on those. We're using a factor of 0.8 in May, and don't worry about the off season because you should be irrigating in December. But in September, it's at a 0.8 factor. So keep this in mind, because when we're scheduling our irrigation on a monthly basis, if you're doing it ahead of time, these numbers mean something. Okay, the calculator also works on for sprinklers, pivot systems, and the rest of that. So here's an example of how it would work with hay on a wheel move system. So again, you're going to be filling in what sprinklers you're using in the real world. You would put in there specifically what you have in your system, or if you're putting in a new system and you wanted to work out a schedule on it, you have to determine what size nozzle you have. So you have to have a little bit more acumen about spacing and all that. And hopefully we were able to help you on some of our earlier sessions designing that, which could help you get in the ballpark of what you need. So sprinkler spacing in this case is going to be a 40 by 60. There's a total of number of sets. How many sets does it practically take you to get through the system? It's taking 8 sets to get across, and we're operating that for 12 hours. 12 hours is not correct in all instances. When you think about it, unless you're up 24 hours a day, you have to have time to move those your sets. So the amount of time to move your sets should be discounted off of the 12-hour sets that you're assuming you're irrigating on a two 12-hour sets a day. You're probably 2 11.5-hour sets a day or something like that. You're doing 2 sets per day. Your flow rate of your sprinkler heads based on that 11/64 nozzle is at 5.7 gallons per minute. We're assuming that we've done a perfect job and we have 72% efficiency, and we're applying water at the rate of 0.23 inches an hour. So over that 12 hours, if you multiply 0.23 times 12, you come up with 2.74. The system being 72% efficient means that you're putting down a net of 1.98 inches of water. So your soil properties, that's all the same as what we looked at before. We'll go that way. You'll see that your monthly climate modifier is different here. Why is that? It's because it's a sprinkler system versus drip system. It makes a little bit of difference. And I also should be pointing out the red highlighted area at the top there versus notice net applied is too high. As you're going through this process, if you fumble and make a mistake in some of your information, it's going to put that up there to help you to get through this. Okay, let's validate what we're doing here. We want to validate that our schedule in the real world is going to operate. This picture in the middle, I wanted to point out. It's a good an example. What that is one of the devices we're going to show are watermarks. Watermarks are something that go down into the ground. They're hooked up with a wire onto them. So you see 2 clips higher than the other 2 clips. What that is identifying, and it's easy for the way he's done it on this particular application, so that he's got 2 sets of sensors in on this particular crop. When you do that, if you mount them inside of a PVC pipe, such as he has done here, drill a hole and put the 2 lower, intuitively being assuming that to be the lower set of sensors, and the 2 above it being the higher set of sensors, you'll know right away which ones you're clipping onto to get your readings on for each day. It's a good, sensible way of doing it. ET is a guess. Soil moisture is a proof of exactly how much water you're getting into your soil. The appropriate sensors that you use are important. It's going to be based on soil texture, crop, and aerometer charts. So the 2 devices that we're going to discuss today, there are a lot more, but they're using basically the similar principles. The tensiometer has got a porous ceramic tip on it. For those of you who may not have seen it, you have a tube, and the gauge that's at the top is a vacuum gauge, and it's measuring the capillary action, the draw on the soil, vacuum that's created. The higher the centibar reading is going to give you an indication of where your soils sit, too moist, too dry. The one on the others is the electrical resistance one. It's called the watermark. The watermark sensors are put down in the ground, as the soil dries, its electrical resistance varies. And so your meter clicking on, as the picture before showed with that PVC pipe with the two sets of connections, is what you would click those onto and get your readings from that. So this is telling you what we're looking at here is moisture levels in your soil. You need to identify this. You can do this by, if you know that you have a sand soil, for example, 75 to 100% moisture, it'll stick together slightly. Sometimes it forms a weak ball. This is similar to what we had talked about before. But these soil texture charts, they're free online, and the BC Irrigation Management Guide on page 175, you can get some charts on that. And it'll vary for loam soils, 100% moisture. If you wanted to know your moisture content in your soils, you could actually weigh it, the dry weight of the soil, compare it, or send it to a lab again. Another way to get that. What this is showing you is from field capacity, your soil storage to permanent wilt, your soil, as tension increases in your soil, and the suction levels will vary. It's going to be different. Soils are going to have different readings, centibar readings, based on like, so for example, a 20 centibar reading on a sand soil versus is going to be different on a clay soil. The suction will be different. So you need to know that. They usually have, like, with all of these, they'll have a chart with the aerometers or the watermarks, and this chart will show you where you would start to irrigate when you're starting to be in trouble. So it's giving you an idea what these numbers will actually mean to you. So here, what I was talking about here with loamy sand, 15 centibar, the soil moisture is around 60%, and then it varies as you see going down the chart with the different soils. I think that at this point, it's a good time to mention that you need to select the appropriate sensor for your application. Sensors are, if you have a heavier soil, a clay soil, you're getting far more accurate results out of your watermarks. That would be the device to use. If your soils are lighter and sandier, the potentiometers are even better for that application. If it's a very fine sand and if it's a very shallow rooted crop, you should go to what's called a low tension tensiometer. It reads more accurately at your lower centibar readings. So that would be the one you want to have. Keep in mind, the one downside I feel about the tensiometer, maybe not so much the low tension one, but the other tensiometer is they cannot stay in the ground over the winter. You have to pull them up each year. So it is a little bit of a challenge. The watermarks, you put them in the ground, you put them at the height you want them, and they're there to stay. But in the lighter soils, they work fine, but they're not going to be quite as accurate as the barometers will be. Where do you put these sensors? Well, it's going to vary a lot. Obviously, if you have different crops, you want to identify each of the different crops. If you have different varieties, some people will even break it up that way. But generally, you want to look at situations like, if you know there are variances in your soil, I would highly recommend you put in relative to those soils. You might want to break that up a little bit. Your topography, if within that same area with the same crop, you have some significant elevation changes, again, you want to break it up accordingly. And you never want to have just one, unless you're, of course, dealing with a 6-inch crop. You're not going to just have one sensor for your crop. A deep-rooted crop, a 4-foot crop, you need at least 2 sensors in the ground. You would want one in the shallower part of your roots, so say at the 12-inch, and then another one at the 24, well, I say 36 to 48 inch, depending on it, but on a 4-foot root crop zone, you want it that way. Also, if you've identified your soils already and you know every 12 inches what your soil break is, you may want to have one in the middle. A data logger is a good idea. What does a data logger do? A data logger can be connected in the case of the watermarks. You can hook them up to a controller, and the data logger is going to download all of the information on a daily basis, and it's going to give you that information that you can utilize. You can send that to your PC, and then you can print graphs and everything like that. Use it for some historical idea of what you went from year to year. It's giving you good, knowledgeable information on how to modify your schedule based on information from previous years. When do you read those? Before or near, typically what I tell people is if we are looking at wanting to irrigate field capacity, as I said before, 2 to 3 days you're at field capacity. So right after an irrigation, the next day after an irrigation, you might want to irrigate. When you reached field capacity, maybe 2 or 3 days later, you might want to look at it. Other people will go in the middle, like if you're in the sprinkler system and you're on a 10-day set, maybe at the 5-day mark, you want to monitor it. And then if in your calculations you determine that it is a 10-day set, it's good to look at it then to see what are my readings at this point. Where am I? What am I going to trigger at? If you haven't reached a level that you should be triggering your irrigation at, well then perhaps you can modify your irrigation cycle a little bit. But this is telling you based on the real world what's happening in the ground. Automation, maximize your efficiency. How does a controller maximize your efficiency? Well, it's giving you that ability that manually you may not have the time in the day to do it. If you know that you can automate a system so that you don't have to go on a 12-hour set, so it's easy to change. You can run as many along as runtime as you require for that particular thing. So in a drip irrigation system where you're watering on a daily basis without having a controller, it makes it a little painstaking to go out and be changing your system all the time. So automation is good. Before you buy a controller though, you want to make sure that the controller is going to do the job for you. So in other words, if you have an idea of what would be the optimum way to operate your irrigation system with a controller, make sure that that controller has the ability to do it. Make sure, like for example, if you're watering on a 12-hour set and you had overhead sprinklers or something in, that you can in fact have a controller that will operate for 12 hours. If you want to have multiple programs and the likes of that, some people want to have the ability to fertigate through a system and various other things. That is a real attractive advantage to be able to do that. You can get numerous types of controllers to do this job. If you have no power available, they've come a long way on battery operated controllers that can go out in the field. You can usually get them in single station 4 up to usually 6 zones. Battery controllers, batteries last a lot longer now than they did in years past, so that's an advantage. Typically, if you're using a battery operated controller, you need a latching solenoid. Why? Because if you don't have a latching solenoid on an AC solenoid, all the time that a zone is powered, typically there's power running to it. So if you had an AC type of a solenoid on a battery system, you'd be wearing out batteries a lot quicker. A new system that a lot of people are going to right now is the 2-wire system. I think there are some real significant advantages to going to a 2-wire system. 2-wire system means that you don't have to run a common wire and then an independent wire to every given zone. You run 2 wires for your entire system, and at each of your valve locations, you put in what's called a decoder. The decoder can be a single zone decoder up to 4 or 6 zones. What the decoder does is your controller is sending out a signal, and that signal adheres to a given decoder. So if you have decoder number 1 is just a bleep or something like that, then it would turn on. If it's a bleep bleep, maybe zone 2 would turn on, and so on. So a decoder system allows you the ability to expand up to 50, 100 zones, depending on the controller you get. So that's very beneficial as you want to develop an area. You have the ability to keep adding zones to it without having to worry about how much wire you have. This slide is up. It was one that was up earlier. But typically, when you go to schedule a controller, how are you going to do that? We've said before that your needs when you program a controller, if you were putting one program into that controller, you would be programming it for your peak ET time, say July, August, 100%. And so that's how you're irrigating. Well, obviously, the real world isn't like that. In May, your peak ET, and those figures may be a little bit low in some instances, but they're going to be a lot lower. June, it might start climbing up, although in the Okanagan in the last few years, June has been pretty wet. And then September, we've had a lot of Indian summers. And so as a result of that, your needs are going to drop from there. In October, depending on your crop, you may not need to irrigate at all. What all that means is, for a rule of thumb, I think when you're programming a controller, you have many different programs. You could have a program in there for your peak ET. You could have a program in there for spring and for fall. By so doing, you're working on historical averages maybe, but you would have the ability to automatically more efficiently irrigate your crop based on the time of the season it is. If you did it, if you have a weather station or something like that, you could even tweak it further. Example in the middle, the tweak by the day is looking at your ETs based on a daily basis, looking at rainfall on a daily basis. So there we're talking more a weather station as well, and it's adjusting it on a daily basis. So ultimately, that's the way you want to go. Rule of thumb, if you don't have a weather station, you don't have access to a weather station, the typical answer is going to give you a more efficient system than just putting everything on peak and calling it a day and watering like that all the time. So the next level, which I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the next level is going to take that information from your weather station, and that information from the weather station is going to allow you to change on a daily basis. You can go to controllers that will automatically modify according to that. You can also look at if you wanted to look at various sensors for various crops, there are a multitude of different sensors that are available, from leaf sensors to stem sensors that goes on a stem or a trunk of a tree. They're called a dendrometer, or you can get ones that'll even go on fruit. If your fruit is too tiny, like a grape or something like that, you could get them, but maybe not. But for larger fruit, you can get a sensor. So what they're doing is they're measuring the tension and the amount of water that's in the areas after an irrigation, and it would be, you have the ability to modify on a daily basis an irrigation system. The irrigation controller of the future creates algorithms. The algorithms are only good over a period of time. You got to get all that information out. You need more than a year. The system will only get better as you go along. But if we need to get to that point, this is the way that we'll be going. And these systems, we've tried some out in here. There's a lot in Israel and places like that. It is the way of the future. So just a little bit of a summary. What are we talking about here? We're looking at strategies. We're looking at things that we don't need to do, things that we can do practically right out of the gate that we could start looking at. Climate change, preparations. Yeah, climate change means that you aren't necessarily going to have less precipitation. You're just going to have that precipitation at different times of the year. So you got to be prepared for that and say, how could I use that water, or how is it going to impact it? Cool, wet springs, don't be fooled by that. Maximize your efficiencies in your irrigation system. How are you going to do that? You need to assess that system. There is a guide for doing irrigation and assessments. Andrew has a copy of that I'm sure he'd be happy to share with you. But maximizing your efficiencies of your irrigation system and assessing your irrigation system and seeing how good it is or how you could go about improving on it, even in a little way, changing your nozzles on your sprinkler heads, for example, something like that, are very good. Big rain, we're good, not for long. Monitor soil. I think we went over that today when the fact that just because you have a big rainfall, the depletion, your ET rates and the rest of that can mean that 36 millimeters of rain means with a 7 millimeter ET in 3 days, you could need to irrigate again, and where a lot of people will wait up to a week between to not do that. I know of instances with crops where when they didn't get behind after big rainfalls, they had impacts. I think cherry is one crop that they feel that has happened to, where they needed to play catch up. And if for those people who didn't have soil sensors and that in the ground, they did not have the ability to know right ahead of time that they should be irrigating a little bit quicker, and it affected the yield in the end. So that's very important. The concept of early and late filling of the root zone is a good concept. You need a deep rooted crop, obviously, to do that. But if you have access to water, obviously, if your water's purveyed to you, that may not be the case. We're early in this season, maybe in March, April, you could start irrigating a little bit so that you're not hitting a drought later on in the summertime. This way here, we have something that we can work on. So and I know that some irrigation districts even are being canvassed right now by a lot of the various agricultural groups to see if there is a possibility of having earlier startups and maybe later shutdowns. We'll see how that goes. But be proactive, see what you can do. Andrew gave an excellent point about what do you do in a drought situation. You look at the possibility of focusing on a portion of your crop, maximizing your efficiencies on that versus trying to get a little bit of water to everywhere. Good point. One other point, though, that you do have to keep in mind is if you're dealing with tree fruits or something like that, you got to keep that tree alive. So everything's going to need a little bit of water. So you got to have that into your equation as well. That's the minimum amount of water you need. And then focus on the areas that you want to make sure you get a crop on. And that's where you give the rest of your water to. Thank you.
Well, that's fantastic. We've managed to use up all of our time yet again, which is why we have a session planned 2 weeks from now, Wednesday, June 23rd. I'll send out the registration link. It's going to be just Q&A from start to finish. It'll be the same 6:30 to 7:30 slot, but Q&A from the beginning to end so that we can cover anything you want. We'll have access to the slides from the last 4 sessions. So if we want to go over another slide, if you've got a question about your particular irrigation system, definitely bring those along. But one thing that we ask is that you can supply as many details as possible, which means it can be even helpful if you send us an email in advance with some of those details. Then we can ask you to fill in any holes on the question. I'll also be sending out a feedback form link. That's extremely helpful for us if you can come up with any thoughts on how we can improve or what we did well. Those are all very helpful to us if you can supply us with that feedback. The whole thing on June 23rd will be unrecorded so that we can feel comfortable talking about our issues, knowing that it's not going to be up on YouTube. So that's another reason that we want to do another session, is so that we can just do it. It'll just be private among us and talk about our irrigation issues. Again, thank you to our sponsors, the Climate and Agriculture Initiative BC, just doing a fantastic job out there. A great comment earlier from Harmony, who was on the call today. Harmony works with the Climate and Agriculture Initiative. They've come out with a report on weather stations in our area and have identified a lot of those gaps. So if putting up a weather station is something that interests you, that's yet more ammunition to take to a funder to maybe get, if you think you've got a farm that's the ideal site for a weather station and it's in a region that's in a gap. Bruce, any final thoughts?
No, I think you hit a good point. I think for the sake of our question and answer period, if people do have issues that they would like to discuss, if they could forward that information to us earlier, if they don't have any problem with us discussing it over in the air with everybody, that might be a valuable asset. I think we could maybe go through the process where whatever the situation is, maybe even look at looking at how we could design, or what a game plan would be to answer some of these problems would be. And the other thing that I was thinking about, and I did mention earlier, is that through this process, if it did work, maybe something we could look at is the possibility even of looking at doing a design for one individual of something maybe not too complicated. That hands-on may be valuable to everyone to understand how they go about the whole process, starting from beginning, how to size your pipe, how to determine where it should be, what's the best system to put in for a given crop, and some options.
Good points, Bruce. Yeah, I think you know, a good idea there. We'll have no trouble filling an hour, I'm sure. And if nothing else, I think going through a design top to bottom, right from the pumps through pipe sizing and getting that even distribution, making a schedule. Also, I should note, for those of you who are still here, we will be coming out with a number of videos soon. Some of them will review some of the key concepts here. Some of them will look around the Kootenays through the summer and into the autumn. We'll be coming out with a couple of videos, so stay tuned for those. You'll want to be signed up with either the KBFA newsletter or subscribed to the KBFA YouTube channel. I'll send you links for those. Speaking of links, a lot of resources came out today. There's the agriculture irrigation calculator, the management guides, all of these guides. They're all available online. They're all free, and I'll make sure you get all of those links. A good point here from Peter Tresher that what your crop needs and how much water you are entitled to may not be the same. So another plug coming up for getting the groundwater licensing session with Andrew Peterson. It's going to be great to have him on the line. He is not in charge of deciding who gets a license. So he's not there to have tomatoes thrown at him. On the other hand, he knows all of those people. So it's going to be a great chance to ask the hard questions. And I know that there are a lot of hard questions to ask about how much water our farms are entitled to with licensing. Anyway, I don't want to end on that note. I'll end on Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors. We are out here to help on any farm issues, including your irrigation. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Give me a call, give Rachel a call, and we'll be happy to talk and see how we can connect you with experts like Bruce, like Andrew Peterson, like so many experts out there, other farmers who are often the experts. That's our job, is to connect people to expertise. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and I look forward to seeing you on June 23rd for a session. Just straight up interaction, talking about questions. Thanks again, Bruce. Pleasure to see you again.
Thanks. Thank you.